The Valdari had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never met a species they could not crush beneath their feet. Supreme Commander Thyric stood on the bridge of his warship, watching the view screen with all four of his golden eyes as his soldiers dragged the captured aliens before him. These creatures were pathetic beyond anything he had ever seen in his long career of conquest and domination. The Valdari were magnificent beings, standing 9 feet tall with bodies covered in natural armor that could stop most weapons. They had 4 powerful arms that could tear metal apart, and their strength was legendary across every known star system. For millennia, they had built their empire on one simple truth: the strong ruled and the weak served, and there was no other way the universe could work. Every species they encountered eventually learned this lesson, some through diplomacy and others through destruction, but all of them learned it in the end. Now Thyric looked at the 7 small creatures that his patrol ships had captured from a damaged vessel drifting through the Korath Nebula, and he felt something between amusement and disgust at what he saw. These beings called themselves humans, and they were soft and fragile in ways that almost defied belief. They had no armor on their pink and brown skin, no claws on their small fingers, no fangs in their mouths, and no venom in their bodies. The ship's scanners had analyzed them completely, and the results were almost laughable. Their bones could be broken with minimal force. Their skin could be cut with the simplest blade, and their bodies needed constant food and water and sleep just to keep functioning. By every measurement, the Valdari used to judge species, these humans were among the weakest beings ever discovered in the long history of galactic exploration. Thyrac's second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Vorath, stood beside him and made a sound of contempt as he examined the prisoners. "What shall we do with them, Supreme Commander? They are too weak for the arena and too small for heavy labor?" Thyric considered the question as he watched the humans being forced to their knees on the cold metal floor of his bridge. Most species would be trembling by now, crying out for mercy, or trying desperately to escape, but these creatures were doing something strange. They were looking around the bridge with curiosity in their eyes, studying everything they could see, and whispering to each other in their primitive language. One of them, a female with dark hair and fierce eyes, was not on her knees at all. She had somehow gotten back to her feet and was staring directly at Thyric without any sign of fear on her face. This annoyed him greatly, so he walked toward her with heavy steps that shook the floor, and he towered over her small form like a mountain over a pebble. "I am Supreme Commander Thyric of the Valdari Hegemony," he announced in a voice that had made countless species surrender in terror. "And you will kneel before me, little creature." The human female looked up at him, and Thyric noticed that her heart was beating fast and her hands were shaking slightly, which meant she was afraid. But despite her fear, she did not kneel, and she did not look away. "My name is Captain Alana Vance of the Earth vessel Horizon," she said in a voice that was steady despite her obvious fear. "And I do not kneel to anyone who has not earned my respect." Vorath made a sharp sound of anger and raised one of his massive arms to strike her down, but Thyric stopped him with a gesture. This was interesting, and he wanted to understand it before he crushed it. "You are afraid," Thyric observed, leaning down until his face was close to hers. "I can hear your heart racing and see the sweat on your skin. So why do you not submit like every other weak species we have encountered?" Elena swallowed hard, but kept her eyes locked on his golden ones. "Being afraid and giving up are not the same thing," she said. "Where I come from, we learned a long time ago that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand up anyway." Thyric had never heard such words from a captured prisoner, and he found himself momentarily without a response. This tiny, fragile creature was lecturing him about courage while standing in the heart of his warship, surrounded by warriors who could kill her with a single blow. He decided to show her the reality of her situation in a way that words could not convey. "Vorath," he commanded, demonstrate our strength to these creatures." His second-in-command smiled a terrible smile and walked to a support beam made of reinforced metal. With his 4 arms working together, he gripped the beam and began to squeeze, and the metal groaned and bent and finally crumpled like paper in his hands. The other humans gasped and moved closer together, but Elena Vance did not even flinch. She watched the display with those fierce eyes and then turned back to Thyrek. "That is very impressive," she said in a tone that suggested it was not impressive at all. "But I have seen strength before. And I have learned that the ability to destroy things is not the only kind of power that matters." Thyrek felt a flash of real anger at her defiance, and he grabbed her by the front of her uniform and lifted her off the ground with one hand, bringing her face close to his. "You will learn your place," he growled. "You will serve the hegemony in our labor camps until your weak body fails, and before you die. You will understand that strength is the only thing that matters in this universe." Elena looked at him without blinking, and even though she was helpless in his grip, there was something in her eyes that he could not identify, something that made him feel strangely uncomfortable. "We will see," she said quietly. "We will see what happens when you try to break something that refuses to stay broken." Thyrek threw her back to the floor and ordered his soldiers to take all the humans to the transport that would carry them to the labor pits of Valdros Prime, where millions of slaves worked until death. As the humans were dragged away, Elena looked back over her shoulder at the Supreme Commander, and there was no hatred in her eyes, no desperation, no plea for mercy. There was only a calm certainty that confused and irritated him. He told himself that she would learn soon enough, that the labor pits had broken species far stronger than these pathetic humans, and that within a week she would be begging for death like all the others. He told himself these things, but somewhere deep in his mind, a tiny voice whispered a question he could not silence. What if he was wrong? And what if these strange creatures knew something about strength that he had never learned? He pushed the thought away and returned to his duties, certain that he would never think about these weak little humans again. He was very, very wrong about that. The labor pits of Valdros Prime were a nightmare made real, a place where hope came to die and where countless species had been worked to death over thousands of years. Elena Vance stood at the edge of a massive mining shaft on her first morning in the pits, looking down into the darkness where thousands of broken slaves dragged heavy carts filled with ore up endless ramps, and she made herself a promise. She would not break, and she would not let her crew break, and somehow, someway, she would find a way out of this hell. The overseer of their section was a Valdari named Gorath, smaller than Thyrek, but still massive by human standards, with scars covering his armored body that showed he had seen many battles. He looked at the 7 humans with the same contempt that every Valdari seemed to feel for weaker species. "You will work until I tell you to stop," he announced. "You will eat what we give you and sleep when we allow it, and if you fall behind or cause trouble, you will be punished in ways that will make you wish for death." He assigned them to the deepest section of the mines, where the work was hardest and where most new slaves did not survive their first month. It was clear that he expected these fragile humans to die quickly and save him the trouble of dealing with them. The first week was brutal beyond anything Elena had ever experienced. The work was backbreaking, the food was barely enough to survive on, and the guards beat anyone who slowed down or showed weakness. 2 of her crew members suffered broken bones in the first 3 days, and she watched helplessly as they were dragged away to the medical pit, where slaves were given just enough treatment to keep them working. But something strange happened as the days passed, something that the Valdari had never seen before in all their years of running the labor pits. The humans with broken bones came back to work, their injuries wrapped in rough bandages, and they kept working despite the pain that would have crippled members of other species. When one human fell from exhaustion, the others would help them up and support them until they could walk on their own again. sharing their tiny food rations to keep each other alive. Elena moved through the pits like a quiet storm, whispering words of encouragement to her crew and to the other slaves they worked beside. She told them stories about Earth, about people who had survived impossible situations, about the human spirit that could endure anything. A month passed, and all 7 humans were still alive. Gorath was confused by this and ordered the guards to work them harder, to give them less food, to make their lives even more miserable than before. 2 months passed, and the humans were still standing, battered and scarred, but unbroken. And now other slaves were starting to watch them with something new in their eyes. There was a species called the Korathi in the pits, insect-like beings with 4 legs and hard shells who had been slaves for 300 years. They had long ago given up any hope of freedom and simply existed day to day, waiting for death. One of them, an elder named Scrix, approached Elena one night in the sleeping quarters, where slaves were packed together like animals. "How do you do it?" he asked in a voice that crackled with age and despair. "How do you keep going when there is no hope of escape, no chance of victory, no reason to continue fighting?" Elena looked at him with tired but determined eyes and smiled despite the pain in her exhausted body. "On my world," she said quietly, so the guards would not hear, "there is a type of creature called a human, and we learned something very important a long time ago. We learned that hope is not something you find outside yourself, but something you create inside yourself, even when everything around you is darkness." She told him about human history, about how her ancestors had survived ice ages that covered half their world, plagues that killed millions, wars that destroyed entire cities, and disasters that should have ended their species forever. "Every time something tried to destroy us, we came back," she said. "We fell down 1,000 times, and we got up 1,001 times, and that is what makes us different from the species who gave up." Scrix listened with growing wonder, and when Elena finished speaking, there were tears in his compound eyes, the first tears he had cried in over a century. "I had forgotten," he whispered. "I had forgotten what it felt like to believe that tomorrow could be better than today." Word spread through the pits like fire through dry grass, passed in whispers from slave to slave, from species to species, and the story of the humans who could not be broken became a legend in that dark place. Gorath noticed the change in the slaves and did not like it at all. There was something different in the way they walked, something new in the way they looked at their guards, and it made him nervous in a way he could not explain. He called the 7 humans before him at the end of the 3rd month and stared at them with fury in his eyes. "You should be dead," he snarled. "Every species we have thrown into the deep pits has broken within weeks, but you refuse to die, and now you are spreading your sickness to the other slaves." Elena stepped forward, her body covered in cuts and bruises, her hands raw and bleeding from the endless work, but her eyes as fierce as the day she had been captured. "It is not sickness," she said calmly. "It is something your people have never understood. It is called hope, and once it starts spreading, it is very hard to stop." Gorath raised his hand to strike her, but something made him hesitate. He had beaten her before, many times, and it had never made any difference. She always got back up, always kept going, always refused to let the light leave her eyes. "What are you?" he demanded, and for the first time there was something other than contempt in his voice. There was confusion and perhaps even a tiny bit of fear. Elena looked up at him, and despite everything he had done to her and her people, there was no hatred in her expression. "We are humans," she said simply, "and we have been knocked down by the universe more times than you can imagine. But we are still here because we learned the most important lesson any species can learn." "What lesson?" Gorath asked, despite himself, genuinely curious about what this small, weak creature would say. Elena smiled, and in that smile was the weight of millions of years of human survival, of ancestors who had refused to quit, of a species that had looked into the darkness and chosen to light a fire. "The lesson is this," she said. "You can break our bones, but you cannot break our spirit. You can hurt our bodies, but you cannot kill our hope. And as long as even one of us is still breathing, we will keep getting up, keep moving forward, and keep believing that victory is possible." Gorath stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his mind, a crack in the wall of certainty that had defined his entire life. He turned away without punishing her, confused by feelings he did not understand. That night, in the darkness of the slave quarters, Scrix and dozens of other slaves gathered around Elena and her crew, hungry for more stories, more hope, more of whatever magic these strange creatures seemed to possess. And Elena gave it to them freely, because she knew that this was how empires fell. Not from a single great battle, but from a million small sparks that eventually became a fire too large to control. The revolution had begun, and the Valderari did not even know it yet. Supreme Commander Theric had not thought about the humans since the day he sent them to the labor pits. But now they were all he could think about, and the reports on his desk made his blood burn with anger and confusion. 3 months had passed, and those fragile creatures were not only alive, but had somehow become the most talked about slaves in the entire Valdari Empire. Reports were coming in from labor camps on 17 different worlds. Stories about a species called humans who could not be broken, who healed from wounds that should have killed them, who shared something called hope with other slaves like it was a weapon. Theric crushed the data tablet in his hands and summoned Gorath to his command ship, demanding answers from the overseer who had failed to destroy these pests. Gorath stood before his supreme commander with shame in his posture, unable to explain what he had witnessed over the past months. "I have done everything," he said. "I have worked them harder than any other slaves, beaten them more severely, given them less food and rest, but nothing works. They simply refuse to break, and now the other slaves are starting to act the same way." Theric dismissed Gorath with disgust and made a decision that would change everything. He would bring the human leader to his ship and discover the truth for himself, and then he would crush whatever pathetic power she thought she possessed. Elena was dragged from the pits and transported to the command ship, her body thin and scarred from months of brutal treatment, but her eyes still burning with that same fierce light that Theric remembered from their first meeting. He received her in his private chambers, a massive room filled with trophies from conquered worlds, the skulls and weapons of defeated enemies displayed on every wall as proof of Valdari superiority. "Do you know why I brought you here?" he asked, circling her like a predator examining strange prey. Elena looked around the room at all the evidence of death and destruction, and then she turned to face the massive alien without flinching. "You want to understand," she said. "You want to know why your methods are not working, why creatures as weak as us are still alive, why the other slaves are starting to change." Theric stopped circling and stared at her with all 4 eyes, impressed despite himself by her insight. "Yes," he admitted, "my scientists have studied your biology, and by every measurement, you are one of the weakest species we have ever encountered. Your bones break easily, your skin tears like paper, you need constant rest and food, and yet you survive conditions that kill stronger beings. Explain this." Elena sat down on the floor without asking permission, her tired legs grateful for the rest, and she looked up at the towering alien with something that almost looked like pity. "Your problem," she said, "is that you only know how to measure one kind of strength. You see big muscles and hard armor and sharp claws, and you think that is all that matters. But there are other kinds of strength that your scanners cannot detect." Theric crouched down to bring himself closer to her level, genuinely curious about what this creature would say. "Tell me about these other kinds of strength," he commanded. Elena nodded and began to speak in the same quiet but powerful voice she had used to inspire the slaves in the pits. "On my world, We are not the strongest animals, she said. We are not the fastest, or the biggest, or the most dangerous. There are creatures on Earth that could kill a human with a single blow. But we became the dominant species anyway. And do you know why? Thyrex shook his head, finding himself drawn into her words despite his contempt for her weakness. We became dominant because we learned to use our minds, Helena continued. We could not outfight a lion, so we invented weapons. We could not outrun a horse, so we invented vehicles. We could not survive the cold, so we invented fire and clothing. Every time nature presented us with a challenge, we found a way around it. She paused and looked directly into his golden eyes with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. But that is not our greatest strength, she said. Our greatest strength is our ability to endure. We are what is called persistence hunters, which means our ancestors did not chase prey by being faster, but by being more stubborn. We would follow an animal for days, never stopping, never giving up, until it collapsed from exhaustion while we were still standing. Thyrex thought about this and felt a strange chill run through his armored body. He had never considered hunting as a test of endurance rather than speed and power. There is more, Galena said. We also have the ability to work together in ways that your species does not seem to understand. When one human falls, others will carry them. When one human is hurting, others will share their pain. We form bonds with strangers and call them friends, and we will fight for those friends as fiercely as we fight for ourselves. She gestured at the trophies on his walls, the evidence of his many victories. You conquer through fear and force, she said, and that works until it does not. But we inspire through hope and connection, and that creates something much more powerful. Your slaves obey you because they are afraid of being punished, but they would follow me into fire because they believe in something greater than themselves. Thyrex stood up and turned away from her, processing her words and feeling something he had never felt before, doubt. You are saying that your weakness is actually strength, he said slowly, that your softness and your emotions and your need for each other make you more powerful, not less. Yes, Helena said simply, and I'm saying something else as well. I am saying that right now, in labor camps across your empire, slaves who have been broken for centuries are starting to remember what hope feels like. They are starting to help each other instead of just surviving alone. They are starting to believe that things can change. Thyrex spun around to face her, anger flashing in his eyes. You are trying to start a revolution, he accused. You are trying to turn my own slaves against me with your words and your stories. Helena shook her head calmly. I am not trying to do anything, she said. I am simply being human. Sharing hope with others is as natural to us as breathing. We cannot help it, and you cannot stop it. You can kill me right now, and it will not matter because the idea has already spread too far. Thyrex raised his hand to strike her down, to end this threat once and for all, but he hesitated. Killing her would prove her wrong about nothing, and it would probably make her a martyr that the slaves would remember forever. You have given me much to think about, he said finally, lowering his hand, but do not mistake my curiosity for weakness. I have crushed 1,000 rebellions, and I will crush this one too. Helena nodded and allowed the guards to take her back to the transport. Maybe you will, she said over her shoulder, or maybe you will discover that some things cannot be crushed, no matter how strong you are. I guess we will find out together. As the door closed behind her, Thyrex stood alone in his trophy room and felt something he had not felt in centuries. He felt afraid, and he did not even fully understand why. That night, reports came in of coordinated uprisings on 17 worlds, all led by slaves who had been inspired by stories of the unbreakable humans. The fire Helena had warned him about was already burning, and he was not sure he had enough water to put it out. The Valdari Empire was burning, not with fire, but with something far more dangerous. The flames of revolution were spreading across 1,000 worlds, and no amount of military force seemed able to stop them. Elena stood in the center of what had once been the main guard station of the Valdros Prime labor pits, now transformed into the headquarters of the growing rebellion, surrounded by beings of a dozen different species who looked at her with hope and trust in their eyes. 6 months had passed since her capture, and in that time, everything had changed. The slaves had risen up, not with weapons at first, but with unity, refusing to work, refusing to be afraid, refusing to let the Valdari break them anymore. Gorath stood beside her now, no longer an overseer but a convert to the cause, his massive form a symbol of how far the revolution had spread. If even a Valdari could change, then anything was possible. The Supreme Commander has mobilized the entire home fleet, Gorath reported, his voice heavy with the weight of betraying his own people. They will be here within 3 days, and they will show no mercy to anyone involved in the uprising. Elena nodded calmly, showing no fear, even though she knew how powerful the Valdari fleet was. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment when all their planning would be tested. Then we have 3 days to get ready, she said. Scrix, what is the status of our network on the other worlds? The old Karathi stepped forward, his compound eyes bright with a vitality that had been missing for centuries. The revolution had given him new life, new purpose, and he had become one of Elena's most trusted advisors. The uprisings are spreading faster than we hoped, he reported. 37 worlds have now joined the rebellion, and more are sending messages of support every hour. The Valdari are trying to put out fires everywhere at once, and they do not have enough water. Elena smiled at his use of her own metaphor. It had spread through the rebel network along with everything else, becoming a symbol of their unstoppable movement. What about the psychological warfare teams? She asked, turning to a tall, blue-skinned being named Vora, who had once been a slave translator for the Valdari High Command. They are working perfectly, Vora said with satisfaction in her voice. We have been broadcasting your speeches to every ship in the Valdari fleet, telling the soldiers about the true cost of the Empire, showing them the suffering of the slaves, asking them to question whether conquest is really something to be proud of. This had been Elena's idea from the beginning. She had understood that the Valdari could not be defeated through direct military confrontation because they were simply too strong, too well armed, too experienced in the art of war. But wars were not won only on the battlefield. They were won in the hearts and minds of the people fighting them, and that was where the humans had the advantage. The Valdari have never faced an enemy like us, Elena had explained to her fellow rebels in the early days of the uprising. They know how to crush resistance with overwhelming force, but they do not know how to fight ideas. They cannot kill hope with a weapon, and they cannot silence a story once it has been told. Now those ideas were spreading through the Valdari ranks themselves, causing doubt and confusion among soldiers who had always been told that strength was the only thing that mattered. Some of them were starting to wonder if there was another way, if the empire their ancestors had built was really something worth fighting for, if the humans and their strange philosophy of hope and unity might actually be onto something. Gorath had been the first Valdari to openly defect, but he was not the last. Every day brought new reports of soldiers refusing orders, officers letting prisoners escape, even commanders quietly sabotaging their own operations. This is what I tried to explain to Theric, Elena said to her inner circle as they gathered around a crude holographic map of the star system. Physical strength only works when everyone agrees that it is the only kind of power that matters. Once you convince people that there are other kinds of strength, the whole system starts to fall apart. She pointed to the approaching fleet on the map, hundreds of warships carrying enough firepower to destroy planets. Those ships are coming to crush us with overwhelming force, she continued, and if we try to fight them on their terms, we will lose. But we are not going to fight them on their terms. We are going to fight them on ours. The plan she outlined was bold and dangerous, relying not on weapons, but on something the Valdari had never learned to defend against, the power of connection and belief. Every rebel ship would broadcast stories as they faced the enemy fleet. Not threats or demands, but stories of suffering and hope, of slaves who had found freedom, of Valdari who had found a better way, of a galaxy that could be united instead of divided. They would not try to destroy the enemy. They would try to reach them, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow into something the Valdari Empire could not survive. Some of you might think this plan is crazy, Elena admitted, looking around at the assembled rebels. And maybe it is. Maybe we will all die in 3 days, and the Valdari will crush this rebellion and go back to ruling the galaxy through fear and force. She paused and let the weight of that possibility sink in. But I do not think that will happen, she continued, because I have seen what happens when people who have been broken start to heal. I have seen slaves who had given up find their courage again. I have seen enemies become friends. And I have seen the most powerful warriors in the galaxy start to question everything they believed. Her voice grew stronger, filled with the conviction that had inspired millions across the stars. The Valdari think they know what strength is, but they are wrong. True strength is not about who can destroy the most. It is about who can build the most, who can lift others up instead of pushing them down, who can look at an impossible situation and refuse to give up. Gorath stepped forward, his massive form trembling with emotion. I spent my entire life believing that might made right, he said. I hurt countless slaves because I thought that was what strength looked like. But then I met these humans, and I watched them take everything I threw at them and keep standing. They changed something inside me, something I did not even know was broken. He looked around at the gathered rebels, his former enemies, who had somehow become his family. I am not fighting for the old ways anymore, he declared. I am fighting for this, for the chance to build something better. And if I die doing it, then at least I will die knowing that I finally understood what strength really means. The rebels cheered, their voices rising together in a sound that seemed to shake the walls. Elena felt tears in her eyes as she looked at what they had built together. A movement that had started with 7 captured humans and grown into something that threatened the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. In 3 days, they would face the ultimate test. In 3 days, they would discover if hope was stronger than fear, if unity was stronger than force, if the galaxy was ready for a new definition of power. She did not know what would happen, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The Valdari home fleet emerged from hyperspace like a wave of death. 500 warships armed with weapons that could crack planets in half. Commanded by Supreme Commander Thyrek himself from the bridge of his flagship. He stood before the viewscreen with all 4 arms clasped behind his back, watching as his armada formed up for the assault on Valdros Prime, ready to crush the rebellion that had dared to challenge 12,000 years of Valdari dominance. All ships report ready for attack, his second-in-command announced. We await your orders, Supreme Commander. Thyrek opened his mouth to give the command that would begin the destruction. But before he could speak, every screen on his bridge flickered and changed. Elena's face appeared before him, calm and determined, broadcasting from somewhere on the planet below. Supreme Commander Thyrek, she said, before you begin your attack, I want to give you one last chance to choose a different path. Thyrek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the bridge. You think I will show mercy because you asked nicely, he mocked. You are even more foolish than I thought. In 1 hour, your rebellion will be dust, and the galaxy will remember what happens to those who challenge the Valdari. But Elena did not look afraid, and she did not look defeated. She looked at him with something that almost resembled compassion. I am not asking for mercy, she said. I am offering you a choice. You can destroy this planet and kill everyone on it, including me and my people, but it will not matter. The idea has spread too far. The fire is burning on too many worlds, and you cannot kill hope by killing the people who carry it. She paused and let her words sink in before continuing. Or you can choose to be part of something better. You can help us build a galaxy where strength is measured by how much you lift others up instead of how much you push them down. You can be remembered not as a destroyer, but as someone who had the courage to change. Dyrek felt a flash of rage at her arrogance, but beneath the rage, something else stirred. The doubt that had been growing since their first conversation, the questions that he had tried so hard to silence. Why would I abandon everything my people have built? He demanded. Why would I throw away 12,000 years of glory for some naive dream of unity? Elena smiled sadly. Because you already know the truth, she said. You have conquered 1,000 worlds, crushed 1,000 enemies, built an empire that spans the galaxy. And what has it gotten you? Are you happy? Are your people fulfilled? Has all that strength given you anything except more strength to maintain? Her words hit him like a physical blow, because they were true, and he knew they were true. He thought about his life, the endless wars, the constant vigilance against rebellion, the knowledge that he ruled through fear, and that fear required constant maintenance. He was the most powerful being in the galaxy, and he was exhausted. Look at your own officers, Elena continued. Look at their faces. They have heard our broadcasts, our stories, our message of hope. Ask yourself how many of them are still certain that this is the right path. Dyrek turned to look at his bridge crew, and what he saw shook him to his core. They were not looking at him with the fierce loyalty he had always demanded. They were looking at the screens, at Elena's face, at the rebel fleet that had formed up around the planet, and there was confusion in their eyes, uncertainty, even longing. One of his youngest officers, barely old enough to hold her rank, stepped forward with tears streaming down her armored face. Supreme Commander, she said in a trembling voice, I have served the hegemony my entire life, but these past weeks have made me question everything. Is this really all there is? Conquest and control and fear forever. Is there not something more? Other officers began to murmur agreement, and Thyric realized with shock that his own crew was wavering, that the ideas Elena had spread had reached even here into the heart of his power. He raised his hand to silence them, and the bridge fell quiet. This is mutiny, he said slowly. I should have you all executed for even thinking such thoughts. But his voice lacked conviction, and everyone could hear it. Elena spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. It is not mutiny to ask if there is a better way, she said. It is courage. The same courage that built your empire in the first place. The willingness to do something new and difficult because you believe it is right. I am asking you to use that courage now, not to destroy, but to create. The bridge was silent for a long moment, the fate of billions hanging in the balance. Then Thyric did something that no one expected. He laughed, not with mockery, but with something that sounded almost like relief. You are the most irritating creature I have ever met, he said to Elena. From the first moment you stood before me and refused to kneel, you have been challenging everything I thought I knew. And now you want me to abandon my entire way of life because you have convinced me that kindness is stronger than cruelty. He shook his head in disbelief at what he was about to do. I must be insane, he said, but I am going to give you a chance to prove that your way works. Stand down the attack. The order rippled through the fleet, and weapons that had been ready to fire went silent. 100 ships that had been prepared to die fighting for freedom found themselves facing an enemy that had chosen to stop being an enemy. In the hours that followed, something unprecedented happened. Negotiations began, not between conquerors and conquered, but between equals seeking a common future. Elena met with Thyric face to face, surrounded by representatives of dozens of species who had never before been allowed to speak as free beings. "You understand that many of my people will not accept this," Thyric warned her. "There will be those who see my choice as weakness, who will try to continue the old ways." Elena nodded. "Change is never easy," she agreed, "but we will face those challenges together. That is the whole point. None of us are strong enough to build a better galaxy alone, but together we might just have a chance." Years later, historians would look back at that day as the moment when everything changed. The day when the galaxy's most powerful species chose hope over fear, unity over domination, and a new definition of strength over the old one. Elena did not live to see everything she had dreamed of come true, but she lived long enough to see humans take their place among the stars as equals, respected not for their physical power, but for their unbreakable spirits. The final entry in the new galactic archive about humanity read simply, "They taught us that true strength is not the ability to destroy, but the refusal to stay down. They are called the unbreakable, and they changed everything." And somewhere in the great beyond, Elena Vance smiled, knowing that her crew's impossible journey had not been in vain. The humans had met the galaxy's dominant species, and strength had taken a new form forever.